Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jenny Liu, and I am a faculty member at Urban Studies and Planning. I am going to be the faculty in charge for this term, along with my colleague, Dr. Kelly Clifton, who is in charge of the civil engineering side of the transportation seminar. So welcome to the first session of the spring seminar. And just really quickly, before I introduce our speaker, just some logistics. So I'll be passing around the sign-in sheet that is attached to this folder here shortly, and you should just mark yourself off for attending. Take a copy of the syllabus inside of the folder if you haven't seen one already. And also for those of you who are new to the seminar, when you do ask, you are required to ask a question during the seminar or write up a question to give to me afterwards. So if you do actually ask your question in class, please state your name for the record, and even if you're not in the seminar, it's always a good idea to tell the speaker who you are, and also to get the microphone before you do start speaking, I think. So without further ado, I'm going to be introducing our speaker today. So we have Professor Nico Larco here from the University of Oregon. He is an associate professor in the School of Architecture, and he is very interested in research on sustainable urban design, active transportation, street design, and how the urban design affects the sustainability of city buildings. And he has designed and developed the Sustainable Urban Design Framework. And today he's going to be talking on this topic, Urbanism Next. So I am going to turn the floor over to Professor Larco.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Great. Thank you for having me. Glad that you're all here. So as mentioned, I'm Nico Larco. I'm coming from the University of Oregon, but not from Eugene. I'm actually based here in Portland at the White Stag building. We have about 400 students up here, and very happy to be working with people at PSU on these topics. So as was mentioned, my background is in architecture and urban design. I've done a lot of work in sustainability, but today I'm going to be talking about this different aspect which actually affects sustainability a lot, called Urbanism Next. I'm coming actually from the Sustainable Cities Initiative. I'm one of the co-directors, aside from being a professor in architecture and urban design at the university. I'm also one of the co-directors of the Sustainable Cities Initiative, which is a multidisciplinary organization at the University of Oregon, which does a whole range of different things, research much like this. We also do the Sustainable City Year program, where we partner with one city or agency each year and put between 25 and 35 courses towards that. And next year, we're going to be working with TriMet on the Southwest Corridor, so we're looking forward to working with people at PSU on those topics. We also do work in China, and then we do all kinds of training. So the topic that I'm talking about today is this question of how it is that cities are going to be changing in the future based on things like autonomous vehicles, e-commerce, and the sharing economy. And while there has been a tremendous amount of research on these technologies, on the sensors, on safety issues, on how it works, on how to implement, there has been next to no research on the secondary effects on cities. How is this going to affect land use? How is it going to affect design? How is it going to affect the way that we live in cities? And so that's the thing that we're really looking at, these secondary effects. And I put this slide up here. This is a slide I actually found on Google, because when we think of the future of the city, we think this. Oh, that's how we know when we're going to get to the future. But the future is arriving, and right now the future looks a little bit like this. And yet we are about to get the technology that we seem to project on that other world. But in this is Tampa. I gave a talk on this recently there. And I think that part of the problem that we're having right now is that we have continually thought of these things, these topics that I'm talking about, as these fantasy land, science fiction things that are going to happen in the future, cars that can drive themselves. We're going to get everything on the internet, and well, maybe that doesn't seem so fantasy land. Well, the things are happening now. The things are happening now. They're coming quick, and the ramifications are large. So we need to be paying attention to these things. As I mentioned, the topics that we're going to be looking at are autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, which a lot of advancement in that, on e-commerce, and on the sharing economy. And mostly I'm going to be talking about in this lecture on things like Lyft and Uber. Car2Go is also part of that as well. And I'm not going to talk very much at all about these technologies themselves. As I said, I'm going to talk about the ramifications they have for cities. I'm an urban designer by training, planning and architecture also by training, but my interest is in the cities and the effects this has on cities. So we're going to be looking at kind of how this affects cities. This is a great slide that I found from the New York Times that looks at, to give you a sense of how quickly is this coming. I always get the question of, is this happening now? When should we be worried, or is this still some distant future? Are my kids going to be dealing with this, or my grandkids? This is a great slide that shows the adoption of technology, the rate of adoption of technology over time. And if you look at it, what you notice is that our curve, so if you look at the telephone, for instance, this has a pointer, yeah. So if you look at the telephone, which is up here, right? It took about 90 or about 100 years to get to 95% uptake in technology, right? Take a look at the cell phone, 10 years. All right, so what you see is as we go further in time, the rate at which we take up technologies and we adopt it as a society is much, much, much faster. So that's one issue. And so now we say, okay, but where are we in this stuff happening, right? Or have we started this curve yet? Well, yes. Yes, we have, and very quickly. So in September of last year, just a few months ago, for the first time, autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, were active in this country, in Pittsburgh. They're actually running right now. Right now, we actually also have them in San Francisco and in Phoenix. So you can go right now to Uber today and get in a self-driving car. There'll be someone behind the wheel, but they won't touch the wheel. Right? They're only there to take over if there's a problem. So it's here. It's happening. They also did that in Singapore, a couple other places around the world that have it. The following month, in October, a company called Otto had the first freight delivery, so trucks shipping things, right? And this happened in Colorado. Kind of interestingly, beer was the first delivery with Budweiser. But this was a truck that went from the factory, right, from where they're producing the beer, to a distribution center, all on its own. So these things are happening. We've already started that curve. And these are a couple months old. Already there's more things that have happened since then. And then the last topic with the issue of e-commerce, in November of last year during Black Friday, there were more, this is actually the second year, there were more e-commerce sales than there were in-store sales, right? And that over that holiday season, this holiday season that we just passed in December, there was a drop of 12% in the number of people who walked into a store compared to the year before. Think about that. 12% drop in 1 year of the number of people who walked in a store. So in theory, we should need 12% less stores, right? Or some such math is going to happen eventually. So these things are happening. These things are happening. And as I mentioned, there's been a lot of work thinking about how these technologies work. And there's a little bit of, I'd say, almost like giddiness about how the technology works. But we haven't taken a look at, okay, so what's this mean for us? What's it mean for our cities, for the way that we live, for the way we design? Looking at this chart as well, if we think about kind of the rate of change that happens in urban areas, right? Our time frames are typically in the decades, 50 years, 100 years, right? So as cities develop and grow. What happens when our technology happens in 10 years or in 3 years or in 2 years, right? The technology is happening much faster than we can adapt our built environment. So whereas, in theory, we've always should be somewhat forward-thinking in how we think about what we plan and what we build, it is critical now that we do that because the technologies are coming fast. And if we're not, we will be caught off guard and we will have problems. So as I mentioned, I started looking at this about 1.5 years ago. And when we started looking at it, we thought that there was going to be a ton of work out there on this topic, and that we were going to try to find kind of like where the gaps in the information was. And what we found was that there was very little information out there. There's a whole lot of speculative work out there, but very little research work, I'll say, on these topics. And as I mentioned before, a ton of research on the technologies, not on these secondary effects. So what we've done is, and what I'm going to be presenting on today, is we're trying to get our arms around this topic and figure out what are the main parameters of what parts of these technologies should we be paying attention to, and then what effects should we be thinking about. so that we can even start to think about what the questions are that we should be asking, where we need more research, and probably most importantly, how can we shape the future that is coming at us very quickly. So I'm going to talk about a few of the parameters or inputs to this. So these are the technologies, pieces that are coming right off the technologies, that then we're going to talk about what their ramifications are. So the first one is this question of what the role of transit is going to be, and it's really what the role of the relationship between transit and ride sourcing. And ride sourcing is your Ubers and Lyfts type businesses. Currently, there seems to be a kind of a nice symbiotic relationship. I would say that up until about a month ago was my feeling, where Uber and Lyft do a fantastic job of helping transit, right? So they're great for first and last mile. So when we think about a transit trip, oftentimes the most difficult part is getting to the station or from the station to where you want to go. And Lyft is fantastic for that. It can pick you up and drop you off there, and it actually expands the reach of that. And actually, many transit agencies, Seattle is a good example, were partnering with Uber on helping with those types of trips. And so you could think of these ride sourcing companies actually helping expand the use of transit. But there's another side of it, which is, if I live in Hollywood out here, outside of Portland, or at the edge of the downtown here, and I usually bike in, but when I don't, I usually go down to transit. And at what point, all of a sudden, do I start to think, oh, I should take Uber to the transit, and why don't I just take Uber all the way in? And I skip transit altogether. And so that's a question of, will these things be in competition, or will they be collaborating with each other? And we have some data from New York, which is a little bit frightening. It came out last month, that the number of trips that happened in New York over, I think it was a like 16 or 18-month period, the number of ride sourcing trips tripled, right? And it's 500,000 trips a day that are happening in New York on these things. So that's one piece, it's just the volume of it, and the rate of growth is just tremendous. And the second thing is that for the first time in a long time, the number of jobs in New York City did not correlate to the number of the amount of ridership that you had on transit. So transit trips actually went down, while what we'd expect the demand for transit should have been going up. And so what the speculation is that people are using Uber and Lyft instead of transit. That is frightening. If all of a sudden we're no longer using transit, or some people are no longer using transit, that is a huge shift in how we move around cities, and a huge burden on a financial problem for transit companies or transit agencies. The second part, I'll talk a little bit more about that. The second part of this is the question of not just the line haul kind of the way we think of MAX or light rail or buses, but this idea of paratransit. Now, that's one of the images that you have here. These are two different paratransit autonomous vehicles, existing autonomous vehicles that exist in the world, types of transit, but they're small. They take 6, 10, 12 passengers, and they move around. They don't necessarily do the line haul type thing. So put that together with things like Lyft Line or Uber Pool, right? These are, if you're not familiar with those services, I call Lyft Line, and a Lyft driver comes, picks me up, but it's like a carpool. They also have a couple other people in the car, and I might drop off one of them before it drops me off, right? So that's a tremendously efficient way of making the system work. It's actually costs less money for me, so it makes sense for the user. But we can imagine a system where all of a sudden we have atomized transit. So all the transit is all these little bitty trips that are happening all over the place, completely optimized with the technologies we have. Very good, right? But it's a really different a system of how we organize transit. Think about ideas, for instance, of transit-oriented development. Does that still exist? Right? How does that work when all of a sudden this is how we're getting around? Next parameter is this question of fleets versus individual ownership. It is a large question of, will we own our own cars? Or will we just be using, will Lyft have all the cars in Portland, or a couple different companies have those cars, and we'll just use them as we need to? Huge ramifications for this. Now, will that happen? Most people who are my generation, I'm in my 40s, early 40s, find it very hard to believe that we might ever not have cars anymore. And I, even as much as I don't use my car, I still also find that hard to believe. But when we look at younger generations, I'd say people in universities and down to my kids, it all of a sudden becomes more believable. If you grow up with using these types of services, at what point does it make sense for you to put down $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 to get one kind of car? When I use this, as we think of this developing, I could call up and say, I need a 8-person car because I'm going to go do something with my friends, or I need one that's got a bed because I'm going to do a 20-minute trip and I would love us to take a nap, or I'd like one that has an exercise bike in it so I can exercise while I go, or the yoga mat, right? And I was telling someone the other day that I have had this feeling of that maybe my grandkids are going to look at me one day and be like, you only had access to one kind of car? How did you do that? Like, why would you do that? Right? So I think there's large incentives that'll push us almost surreptitiously towards this thing. And maybe people will continue to have cars, but maybe they'll start using them less and less because these other services will be easier and work well. So that's a big question. Large ramifications I'll talk about. One of the biggest ones is parking. If we don't have our own cars, then we don't need a place to store those cars, and that has huge implications for the city. Again, these are the inputs to. Then we'll get to what the ramifications are. Next is the question about the cost of autonomous vehicles and their trips. So there's been a whole lot of fantastic studies. Joe Courtwright from City Observatory, I think it is here in Portland, did a really good kind of a summary of many of the studies that are out there. And more or less, you're looking at somewhere between 20 and 50 cents a mile per trip for autonomous vehicles. There's a whole lot of reasons why that happens. Mostly it's if you look at the shared model of vehicle ownership, we're getting much more utility out of each car, so we don't have this sunk cost of the car. But the big question with this is, as we reduce the cost of transportation and as we increase the ease of transportation, typically models that we've looked at for demand management say that we will increase our consumption of transportation. So that's one thing, right? So if these things get really cheap and easy, we are going to be taking many more trips, which is a whole bunch of kind of congestion kind of issues. And the second piece of this is this question of equity. On the one hand, as trips become cheaper, this actually might be really good. It has a fantastic kind of utility side for equity. On the other, what if this costs just below what it costs to use transit? All of a sudden, transit might go away. Well, let me tell you worse. What if it costs just above what it costs to use transit? So there's a number of people who can still afford this, but there's a bunch of people who can't. And all of a sudden, transit no longer has enough people riding it so that it can survive. That would be a large ramification. And again, with all these things that I'm talking about, the concern is that the impacts are going to be hitting us faster than we are changing our structures, and we're not prepared for them. Next question is, how quickly is e-commerce going to be dominating? And the answer is quickly. It's already, so the chart, I'm not sure if you can see it up there, but in 2015, it was about 7% of total retail sales. It's projected that by 2020, it will more or less double to be 14% of sales. Half of that is Amazon. A huge amount of the number of sales that are happening, right? So we are heading in this direction. We are heading in this direction, and that has tons of ramifications for the number of trips that exist, how we do distribution in the country, what kind of freight delivery looks like, and then also where do we go? Right now, what if we all of a sudden need 10, 20, 30, 40% less commercial areas in our cities? What happens to our cities when that happens? And then also, as a corollary, what happens to the revenue that we get, not in this state, but in most every other state, on sales tax? Amazon just agreed to start collecting sales tax for the things that they sell. But half of Amazon's business is things that they don't sell, that they're third-party sellers, right? So there's, half of, or a quarter of the entire market is the only part that's collecting right now taxes. That's a huge loss of revenue. How do we deal with that? And also, I talked about this before, this huge drop in in-store sales that happened this past holiday. So e-commerce is coming. It is coming. And the last piece that we're looking at is actually, this is some research that Jennifer Dill worked on here at PSU, which is we're looking at if you take away the friction of transportation, where do we want to be? Where would we be? How do we make the decisions about where we want to live? And how much does transportation play a role in that, right? Because if all of a sudden moving around is really easy, I'll give you a scenario. I live 20 minutes away from here, let's say. I don't, but let's just say I did, and I commute 20 minutes a day in a car. All of a sudden, 20 minutes is going to get me further away, right? If I want to really be further out, I can be further away. Oh, and maybe I'll do 30 minutes because now I can actually be like watch a movie or talk to my kids or sleep or do something. I might actually go further out, right? So if I really want wild open space, I might be able to do that. So if that's a desire I have, if we take away the friction of transportation, we might see massive changes in our metropolitan footprints. So we've been looking at things like the National Association of Realtors and PSU together looked at does a survey of residential preference, and we're looking at how much do people wanting to be what are driving people? Is the place you live based on you don't like long commutes? Uh-oh, that's the case because we'll go further out then. Is it based on that you want lots of open space? Uh-oh, because we'll go further out now. Is it based on that you'd like to walk to a local, like a store or a coffee shop? Ah, that's great. Actually, now that becomes a lot easier because we can build more densely. We'll talk a little bit more about these things. But trying to get a finger on the pulse of why people are living where they're living and then putting a filter over that of how much of that is based on transportation and how will that change with the transportation changes that we're seeing. So those are the 5 main kind of parameters, inputs that we're looking at. So you can see that we're looking at the technology, not for the technology piece of it, but for what these ramifications are. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about these 5 design and development effects. Land use, space and physical design, street design as well, tendencies toward density and proximity, tendencies towards dispersion and sprawl, and then this question of vitality and activity, kind of the buzz within the city. All these things that are going to be changed with these technologies. So first, land use. The biggest piece that we can think about has to do with the parking reuse or elimination. So if we go to shared vehicles, which I think there's a lot of tendency for us to push in that direction, then we don't need anywhere near as much parking as we need right now. And in fact, there's been a number of studies, a number of different people have done studies of this, that look at a reduction of, that we'll only need between 10 and 15% of the parking spots that we have right now. That is a tremendous reduction in the number of parking. Donald Shoup's done studies that show that the largest single land use in cities is parking, right? And all of a sudden that parking becomes available. There's actually a study that was done by people in San Francisco, Arup, Nelson Nygaard, and Perkins and Will, and they're projecting that I think it's 10 years of growth within Los Angeles can happen within its parking lots. So, yeah, we're talking about a lot of space here. So land uses could shift tremendously, right? And with land use shifts will come actually land value shifts. We also have a new land use, which will be fleet storage. So Lyft is going to need somewhere to put all those cars when they're not in peak demand and to charge them and to clean them and all that. Where are those things going to go? They're going to be high traffic, right? Because there's going to be cars coming in and out of that all the time. Well, how's that going to work? We also have, with these issues, we have a couple other big changes. One is bricks and mortar, retail development. Is that going to get consolidated? If I'm in a city that has 8 strip malls in it in the suburbs, maybe I only need 3 of those, right? Oh, and by the way, since I don't need parking, maybe those things will become much denser. Maybe I really don't need that many of those. How might that change how we organize our land uses? We can also think about the e-commerce. We're going to have a whole new thing of warehousing and distribution, a shift in this land use. Right now, Amazon is building distribution centers, DCs, that are between up to 1.4 to 1.6 million square feet, right? It's something like 16 to 20 Portland blocks, one building. Enormous. And then there's a ton of money smaller, 50 to 75,000 square feet land warehouses that are going to be happening everywhere. And my sense is stores are going to become much more where they'll be half store, half warehouse, right? Distribution kind of centers for these things. That's a shift in how we think about land use in general, and we know how tied land use and transportation are. One thing that I missed talking about is also the shift away from all the, especially if we go to shared vehicles, all the auto-related uses. So if we go to shared vehicles, which I think we'll probably also go electric vehicle, but that's a different conversation. But even just if we do shared vehicles, we don't need gas stations anymore. Right? We won't own our own car that we need to go fill up, so that can happen somewhere else. We don't need people to sell us cars, right? So all the auto malls are gone. We don't need maintenance shops. All these changes that will be happening based on this one tiny, large shift in autonomous vehicles. And then finally, this question of where do we live? So if we think about housing as a land use, where will housing happen? What about densities of housing? How might that shift? I'll talk a little bit more about that. If we look at space and physical design, like the actual physical design of cities, there's also going to be a significant changes. In terms of parking, it's hard to overstate how dramatic these changes are going to be. So all of our lots and structures, so you look around downtown Portland or even the outskirts of Portland, the outskirts of the center, all those lots, surface lots, we no longer need that anymore. That's now land available for redevelopment. Parking lots, parking structures, we don't need that anymore. And there's a big question of what do we do with those? I mention this a lot, but the thing that for me kind of clarified how quickly this is really happening was a conversation I had with a woman in San Francisco who was talking about parking. What she does for this consulting firm is kind of manages parking and how clients should be thinking about parking. And I asked about AVs, and she said her recommendation is, one, you don't build anything that you don't absolutely need, and two, don't build anything that is not flat floors, flat slab, and high floor to floor, so you can convert it into something else. And her reasoning for not building anything you don't absolutely need is that we have, typically when you're building some of these things, you're going to be paying off a bond or a mortgage in 30 years, right? And her take is that it's a calculable risk, a measurable risk, that between now and 30 years, you will not need to park a car there, which means you do not have revenue. Crazy. It stopped me in my tracks when I heard that. Wow, we need to be making these decisions now. Well, guess what our codes still say, right, for how much parking we need. And we might be building a whole lot of parking that is going to be obsolete before the thing's paid off. Crazy the rate of change that we're seeing. There's also good things that will happen in the urban environment. Parking is usually a little bit blightish. It's not the most beautiful thing. There's not going to be those gaps in the urban fabric because we need to have cars. There's also huge changes that will happen in terms of building density. So sometimes we're limited by our building heights because of zoning. Sometimes we're limited by our building heights because of how much parking we need to provide. So I can't build more units because for every unit, I need to put in that much more parking and that much more parking, right? And all of a sudden that goes away. And then because that goes away, now the entire building can be profitable uses, can be usable space. You don't have to build parking, which usually costs you money, doesn't bring in money, right? So it's a big shift for the feasibility of projects, right? And the density possible for projects. Those should be good things for people who are interested in urbanism. And then we also have increases in density as the lots themselves are filled. So as I mentioned, downtown we'll fill these in, but then think about the suburbs. Think about that strip mall I was talking about. In a typical suburban strip, about half the land is parking, half the land compared to the usable space, right? So all of a sudden, all that is no longer needed for parking. Well, we can put that to better uses. So that can become more development. We can put housing in there. Suburban strip malls might actually become these semi-urban nodes. And within suburbia, the only thing we need space for right now anymore after that is our yard. I don't need space around all that parking that goes around the mall or around the strip mall, and I don't need space around all that parking that goes around the office park. All that is gone. So a huge rethinking of how we think about the development in suburbia, would happen fairly quickly. Okay. In terms of street design, it's a big question here. On the one hand, we have the reduction or elimination of parking on the street, which on the one hand is great. Right-of-ways, available right-of-ways have huge limitation for how much what we can do on streets, especially when we think about alternative modes or active modes like walking and biking or even transit. almost always the limitation, there's not enough room for it. Well, all of a sudden we might get all that room back. We have parking that will be gone, and then the lanes themselves might be narrower, or there might be less lanes. Right? So all of a sudden there's more space available. This could be a big boon. A big question, though, is that parking goes away, and right now parking does a really good job in urban areas to be a good buffer between the active street and so car traffic and people walking and biking. And all of a sudden that buffer will go away. So we need to rethink how we might do that. A large question is drop-off zones. Right now, as much as we like or don't like parking, it is a place where we kind of can interface and get from cars on to become pedestrians and go into buildings and such. What happens when we no longer have that? Imagine everyone who drove to their office building this morning now having to wait to get out in front of the office building at like 8 o'clock when everyone's arriving at the same time. Curbside space will all of a sudden be a large premium, and my guess there might be a new fee kind of associated. Like you can get dropped off right in front of where you want, or you can get dropped off at this like distribution center for people, right, where we get people in and out of cars. That's a few blocks away. It seems like that will be a large challenge to make that work. I talked about the reduce and increase lanes with the number. Separation of modes. This is actually a little bit frightening. If AVs are, the algorithm will not let them run over people, which is one of the fantastic things, right? The safety concerns, the safety benefits. But if it won't let it get hit by people, what's to keep someone from jaywalking? Or a cyclist to say, oh yeah, we're going to do like critical mass today, right now. I'm just going to ride in the middle of the street, and all the cars will have to stop. Right? It could be catastrophic, somewhat. The absolutely wrong solution would be to then separate all the modes and put walls or barriers between these things. Right? They would completely destroy urban environments. But what are we going to do about those things? And then there's this kind of smaller question of like the reduction of curb cuts. We are not going to need cars going into buildings so much, so we don't have curb cuts along the street where the sidewalk allows cars to come by. It's going to create a much better pedestrian environment. So you can see that there's pluses and minuses to these things. The point I want to make is the shift is coming, and we need to figure out how we deal with the minuses and take advantage of the pluses here. In terms of density and proximity, there's been a trend that we've been having more and more people being interested in living in urban centers and kind of this buzz of urban life. And will that continue? Will we continue to have that trend? And will all of a sudden it become easier to do that because I don't have to think about, oh, I'd love to live closer to the center, but what do I do about parking and the cost of the car and all that, right? Maybe that'll open up these possibilities. In suburban areas, we really might create these little compact nodes where, because we don't need parking anymore, so everything can get closer together, as I was mentioning before. So the urban design, so we think about this strip mall that's up here, right? All this area could be filled in with something, and that could become like a dense urban node, a walkable node happening within the suburbs. All the things that we kind of have, the amount that parking has controlled the built environment will go away, and the ramifications are really large because there's so much of our built environment that's guided by parking. So we can create these walkable nodes in urban and suburban areas. The question, as I mentioned before, is will this be the end of transit-oriented development on the one hand, right? Because we no longer, if transit doesn't work exactly the same way that we've had, why do we have proximity, right? Or how do we govern proximity, and where does that proximity happen? If the trend of wanting to be in places where I can walk to some activity and have a bar nearby or a restaurant nearby, or well, all of a sudden we can be closer. One interesting kind of corollary to this is, on the one hand, this might point you towards, we're just going to get more and more distributed because we don't have like transit-oriented development and things that kind of tend to bring us together. But on the other hand, Uber and Lyft work better when there's density. Right? There's more cars, more people nearby. It's for the same reason it works for transit. It works for this. All your customers are closer together. I can cover less area or more area with less cars. And so it's possible that some of the trends that we've seen that have pushed towards density for transit reasons might actually do that as well for ride sourcing reasons. And this is like more wishful thinking, but this question of NIMBYs, not in my backyard, don't build that here. Oftentimes one of the complaints is, well, look at all the parking they're going to bring into this. Like, we don't want all those cars. Well, they're not going to have parking anymore, right? So maybe that will allow that to happen. But one other thing I'll mention is there might actually be, well, I'll talk about that in just a minute in one of the other slides. The opposite piece of that is this question of will there be more dispersion or sprawl? So if we take away, as I mentioned, this friction of travel, will we take that longer commute? So that person, as I mentioned before, who was willing to do a 20-minute commute, now might do 30 minutes, and 30 minutes actually takes you further away. There's a really great study. It's actually by Georgia Tech. It was on the radio on Wednesday, and I said Virginia Tech, and it's Georgia Tech that did this. What they looked at is they did transportation surveys looking at how people are moving around, right? And then took that information, brilliant methodology, took that information and paired it with Zillow data. So what they could figure out is where you live and where you work and how you move around like that. And then they could figure out, because they know who you are, when did you buy your house? Oh, and with Zillow, I know every other house that was available to buy at that time. So they're putting regressions together that say how much was transportation a factor in deciding where it is that you decide to live. And if we take away transportation as being this friction, where would you have chosen, right? It seems like, oh, you want this kind of school, and, obviously we want things to cost less, and you want these kinds of amenities. Well, where else is that available? And what they more or less found is that the city flattens out so much, especially for people who are younger than 40 and with kids, right? You will live further and further away from the center because houses will be cheaper, and it'll be you no longer have friction, the transportation, the commute concern kind of keeping you closer together. That we should feel a little bit better that we live in Oregon that has urban growth boundaries and kind of contains that. But what happens in cities around the country, like large metropolitan cities that don't have that, right? Do we see a huge acceleration of sprawl potentially with that, at least in residential preference? And what will we have for limits for urban sprawl? The last topic I want to talk about is this question of vitality and activity, or urban vitality, which is not at all talked about when people, many of these other things are not talked about at all, but this one's particularly no one's talked about when we think about the rise of autonomous vehicles and e-commerce and all of this. But the buzz that happens in cities, in urban areas, what will happen to that with these technologies? So one possibility is that there's a reduction of these things. So if we take any typical street here in Portland, and now you eliminate all the people who are walking to and from their cars from the street, and now you eliminate everyone who's going to buy something that you can be buying online, what happens to that street? How many people are still there? So right now we have this great externality of us walking on the street for our utilitarian purposes, which is eyes on the street and buzz and activity and seeing people, right? That's happening. Well, what happens when that goes away? When the number of people goes away, it'll shift where maybe places that are kind of marginal, kind of buzzy places might go away completely. Places that have a lot of buzz might actually go away a whole lot. And what it seems is that maybe it'll be less about proximity or location, right, and more about the environment itself. Like, what's that place like? Which for urban designers, I think, is a boon, right? That there might be this large kind of value sorting of, I go to that place not because it's easy to get to. I go to that place because it's a great place. There's all these interesting things that happen there, right? So we're already seeing those trends, in retail is already going that direction. And then the question, possible reduction just with the shopping districts being diminished. If we just don't have as many places where people go to shop, maybe that will reduce vitality. A big question mark is, what are we going to spend all our time doing? Right? If we're not spending our time driving and going to get gas and buying stuff at the store, what will we do? Well, that's a large question mark that we have to figure out. What kind of built environment do we have for those things? What's going to grow? There's also potential increases to vitality and activity. As I mentioned before, the walkable suburban centers. I think that's a very exciting opportunity, where all of a sudden the strip mall that's been kind of dead and the cars have killed those areas. It might actually be able to be repurposed into something much more active and happening. And then also, this I think is really interesting as well, which is the increased accessibility to these centers. So the example I like to give is, so I live out in Hollywood, right? It's about 2.5 miles away from downtown Portland. I come in here to work every day, but I never come in here with my family like just to come for dinner. It just seems like a pain. If you're going to get in the car, to find parking here and do all that. Well, if Lyft is the way that I'm doing it, it's the way I get it everywhere, and it's so easy. I just step out my door, jump in that, it drops me off, and I know there's going to be one easily coming in. So I might actually come downtown more often with my family. If you want to go get dinner, we could do that, or we could do that one that's over there, a little further away. It's not a difference. So all of a sudden, there could be larger catchment areas for urban places that creates that kind of buzz. One question with all of this, which I haven't talked about so much, but it will be traffic, the question of traffic, how much. I've talked about lots of scenarios where we're going to take more trips or take less trips, or there's definitely the scenario where I take a trip in my car and like go have another car go pick up my kid and have another car go pick up some bananas that I wanted to pick up, and all of a sudden we've got tons of congestion. And generally, the models that are out there right now say that for transportation demand management, that the projections are that there will be much more traffic with AVs, a significantly less amount, although still more, if they're shared, right? But in general, there's people talk about the congestion cliff. If we go to all personally owned AVs, that there will just be an enormous amount of traffic that all of a sudden we'll be hitting. So those are the 5 main points that we're looking at. Where are we heading with this research? As I said, we started this about a year and a half ago. Our biggest goal right now is organizing the framework of how we think about this so that we can, and kind of the pieces I went through today, and then also gathering people who are working on these topics in a range of fields. We've got a great network we've developed of planners, architects, urban designers, landscape architects, and developers who are looking at this. We're doing a charrette on April 24th here in Portland. We are packed. We were expecting about 25 people, and we've got 55 people coming in from all over the country to look at this issue. So we're going to look at 3 sites around Portland and think about what kinds of things might happen in a future where we have shared autonomous vehicles. And we're hoping to have a number of publications and some videos that come out of that, so we'll be able to share the information that we get from there. We're going to be presenting at the AV Symposium in San Francisco in July, and the idea behind that is to get people who are in the technology side of that to start thinking about the ramification of these pieces. We've got some grants out to NSF and other places. In the spring of next year, I'm the American Institute of Architects, AIA. I'm a member, and I'm actually one of the members of the Regional and Urban Design Committee, RUDC. And next year's conference for RUDC, I'm going to be leading here in Portland, and it's going to be a collaboration between AIA, APA, the American Planning Association, and ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architects, looking at these topics. And our interest is to get a number of different disciplines, all interested in urban design issues, looking at the same time at what these ramifications are. So if people are interested in the room and at PSU, we'd love to be collaborating with that. We're also doing, so U of O, I've talked about the research that we're doing on this, and we're Sustainable Cities Initiative, SCI, is leading this Urbanism Next kind of research initiative. But there's many other things that are happening within that. One example I'll give you is that we're partnering with people in public administration, Ben Clark from UO Public Administration, and Roberta Mann and Heather Brinton from the law school, looking at municipal budgets and what are the ramifications of these things on municipal budgets. What happens when parking revenue goes away? What happens when all of a sudden land valuation changes and more density is possible and land goes up? Do property values go up and property taxes go up? What happens when we need to all of a sudden deal with all this blight because all these businesses shut down and we no longer have revenue from those businesses? What happens when we don't need to have as many emergency services because we're not going to have as many crashes out there, right? So so we're looking at all the different parts of municipal budgets, thinking about what the ramifications of these things are, and then looking. Roberta is an expert on tax policy in the law school, and we're looking at, okay, so what kind of tax structures might we be needing to look at as these things happen? And then finally, I'll say, and I'll invite you all hopefully to take a look at this, we started a blog last year called urbanismnext.uoregon.edu. Please visit and subscribe to it. What we're doing is we're putting articles there. You can take a look, though. There's tons of articles there already. But we're looking at exactly the topics I talked about today. You will not find anything on what the latest AV technology is, or how the new model of e-commerce. But we're collecting research data and articles on what those ramifications are, those secondary effects on cities. So please visit that. And if you see things that are interesting, send them my way. And that's it with that. I'll finish. I'll say, hopefully you got a sense of, one, that this is coming soon. I would say it's already here almost. And two, that the secondary effects are large. There are opportunities, absolutely, but there are definitely pitfalls. I would say, as I assume most of you are in planning, as planners, we have not done a good job of preparing for this, and we need to. We absolutely need to, or else we will be run over, no pun intended, by these technological changes. So I think it's important right now. The first things we need to do are figure out what kinds of things might happen, what are the gaps in the knowledge, and start thinking about what are the regulatory and policy kind of changes that we need to put in place so that we make sure that we are ahead of this curve and not behind it. And with that, I'll take questions. Thank you.
Hello. Test. Can you hear me?
I don't know if there's a speaker in here.
Okay. I had a question kind of related to that. In terms of like automation, both providing pitfalls and providing solutions to pitfalls, something that's always piqued me when it comes to self-driving cars are truckers and taxi cab drivers. So there's like 45 million jobs in America alone right there in taxi cab drivers and truck drivers, 33 million in truck drivers, 10 million in taxi drivers that are probably gone with automation, right? Like we have automated long freight, automated Uber, Lyft, all that kind of stuff.
So
does automation provide some sort of way out for those 45 million jobs? Do we have a solution to match that loss?
No, unfortunately, I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm going to give you more bad news. So the numbers I've seen are 4 million in jobs. So there's this, can't remember the name of the report. It's on the blog, so you can take a look at the blog. I think was last week or the week before the report came out. We put a blog post on it. But there's a report that came out that was looking at driving jobs and what the effects of autonomous vehicles were going to be on that, and it is highly negative. So 4 million jobs lost in the country. 4 million jobs gone. At least, right? So these are trucking, freight jobs, and also taxi and all sorts of bus drivers, all these types of things. It gets worse in that in the study, what they were looking at is what they were talking about is that these types of jobs are really good paying jobs for the skill level, education level that you have. So if you have a level of education that gives you those types of options, that is a really good living wage that you can get in these jobs, and that whole possibility, that whole opportunity will be gone. And not only that, but it affects worse. The minorities are overrepresented in that group. So African Americans, Hispanics are huge populations that will no longer have access to those jobs. And I'll add a corollary to that. They don't talk about it so much in the report, but if you think about many of those jobs are actually jobs that exist in more rural areas and either red state or red parts of your state. And with the political climate that we have right now, that might just exacerbate some of the unfortunate kind of unhappy dialogue that we've had. So that is a large concern. I didn't talk about equity. There are really large equity concerns across the board. I talked a little bit about transit. There's a number of equity concerns about who has access to these things and what happens if this is the main way that we move around. Good question.
My name's Tyler Williams. I'm a structural engineer by trade. So my question's coming more from a concerned citizen standpoint, I guess, because I don't have any expertise here. But the equity, I'm glad you brought that up because that's what I wanted to ask about. a lot of this sounds really cool and fun and great for upper middle class people that can spend $8 going across town and then $8 going back across town. But what does it do for people that can't afford that, or people that don't want to spend their money that way? What can planners do, whether it be on the administrative side or on a planning-based side, to ensure that there is some equity, that there are some ways that people can still get around a city without having a bankrupt transit system or having to bankrupt themselves?
Yeah. That is a great question. So first of all, the cost, the $8 trip will come down, right? Because the biggest cost right now of a Lyft or Uber ride is the driver, which makes a lot of sense because they're putting in a whole lot of the work. But so those costs will go down. But still, there's going to be a big equity issue. Part of the I think what we can be doing as planners and citizens and such is one, getting our agencies and cities to start thinking about these things. But two, also, there's a ton of money to be made in this. I mean, so to give you an example, Ford about a month ago bought Argo, a autonomous vehicle technology company, for $1 billion. $1 billion. They are not thinking that this is like a fun thing to be toying with on the side. They see this as like a core part of their business. And that next week, the CEO of Ford came out and said, cars are not the future of transportation. Right? So they are thinking like the world's shifting. People are positioning themselves tremendously. There are billions and billions of dollars that have gone into the technology, and then companies buying up the technology and partnering those. There's money to be made, and as I would say, this gets a little bit like political stripes here, but as the public realm and the city as a whole, if part of our value is equity, well then we need to make sure that we don't give away everything, right? And make sure, especially if it has detrimental effects. So, but that is going to take a whole lot of thinking of what the path is, and then what are the mechanisms to bring that money in. So for instance, most are it's debatable, but in theory, our infrastructure, our cars, our streets, we pay for it through tax and gas tax and things like that. Well, what if all that gas tax goes away because we use mostly AVs, right, or EVs? I mean, and all of a sudden, we need to restructure our whole piece. There's a lot of talk as well of doing things like we have to think about how we tax the occupancy of the vehicle. So if you have an empty vehicle, you should be taxed highly because you are doing nothing but taking up space and taking up this public good, which is capacity on roads, for no benefit. So you should be taxed really high for all your vehicle miles that are empty. And if you have got a 5-person car, when you have 4 or 5 people, maybe you pay 0. If you only got 2, maybe you pay a little more, right? So we need to think about, and these are really like early ideas that people are talking about, but those are the kinds of things we need to think about to be able to deal with some of the equity concerns. I want to mention one other thing, which you reminded me of something that I meant to talk about before, which is the capacity is a really large question for these, all this. If we go away from transit, right, and all of a sudden everyone's just doing their own cars or even shared cars, but a whole lot more of them, and the number of trips goes up, we run into a large geometry problem of how do we get enough cars through. I mean, so imagine Portland, or more dramatic. Imagine New York City, and everyone's getting in and out in a car. Impossible, right? So there's serious, not only like equity problems, but there's just geometry problems. But what happens if we go through this swing where all of a sudden transit can't survive anymore, or it really gets hobbled, right? And then we run into this huge congestion glut. We need to be preparing for that before it happens. So yeah.
I wanted to ask on the point of transit. I saw a post on social media where in Japan they're starting to do autonomous shuttles to pick up people in rural areas. So on that note, there's lots of different approaches to transit. There's some places that really invest in transit. Well, are you planning on looking at the opportunities and risks for transit operators of going autonomous?
Yes. So I would point you towards the Shared Use Mobility Center put out a report. Sharon, I can't remember her last name. Fantastic report on AVs in transit, which talks about more or less that transit agencies need to rethink of themselves. They can no longer think of themselves as transit agencies. They are agencies that get people to where they want to go. And sometimes that might be a lift type thing. Sometimes it'll be paratransit. Sometimes it'll be a line haul. So a good example I like to think of is that we think of transit as a more efficient way of moving people around, right, in places where transit works, right, which is a lot of this country is not developed in a way that does that, but when transit works, it's much more efficient, highly more efficient. By the same token, though, having a bus, a diesel bus, like going around at 1 o'clock in the morning with one person in it is not at all efficient. And maybe that should have been like a lift trip, right? So transit needs to become much more flexible and start sizing the vehicle to demand, right? And we have all this technology now which lets us do that more and more, and we can be more efficient with those things. So there are opportunities, there are risks, and TriMet's right now, we actually, we're bringing Jeff Tumlin in. Oh, I didn't mention that. So Jeff Tumlin is going to be giving a talk here. He's a principal at Nelson Nygaard. He's giving a talk on Urbanism Next issues on April 25th. That's Tuesday the 25th at 5:30 in the building, the new UO Business School building right in front of the White Stag. And you can find information on that on our website, sci.uoregon.edu. But he's going to be talking about some of these issues as well.
Yeah. In essence, I think one important piece of what you're saying is that technology is not destiny. It raises all kinds of possibilities. My sense is that the people in power then are going to make choices as to what the values that they want to maximize. Is it equity or is it playgrounds for the rich? That said, I think it's not contested actually here. But that said, what you didn't mention is the impact of global warming and the need to reduce all uses, in particular ones that create carbon pollution. And that, it seems to me, is really the essential. Whether we're going to look at the long term, it might be a long-term crisis, or it might be shorter term, and that would be easier to deal with, it seems to me. But in the long term, it seems to me, if in power, people with short-term profit needs in order to survive are the ones who are, in fact, making decisions and have the power to make those decisions, we're in really deep trouble. And I'm wondering how you're trying to deal with that question, at least with the question of climate change. I mean, it seems to me the challenge, it has going to have significant impact on all of the sort of the contested variables that you talked about.
So it's a little bit of an unknown. So for instance, with the question of climate change, which is a great issue for us to be thinking about with these, there's studies that kind of point in both directions, at least the magnitude of the effects. Because on the one hand, it looks like we're going to be looking at increased number of trips. But there's the possibility that these are they're shared trips, and there's possibility also that they go electric vehicle. So one of the things, and I'm by no means an expert on electric vehicles, but one of the things that seems in some of there's a great report, Rocky Mountain Institute put out a great report on these issues, like peak car ownership, I think it's called. And they talk a lot about EVs. And it kind of points to that, all the work that EVs have done to try to get people to understand, to do it, to buy in, we might not need that anymore, because if it turns out that Uber and Lyft own all the cars, you just need to convince one person, right? You just need to make the economic argument for Lyft to say, we're going EV. And you know what? It's not a thing of but where do I find an EV mechanic? I've got all my own mechanics, right? I own the company, and it could shift like that. And I think there's an economic argument for that to happen, and for a number of different reasons, it would be great. So it could be that there's a benefit on that side that if we go to electric vehicles. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but I think that's a really good question to be asking. What are the longer-term kind of ramifications of these things for climate change? In general, it looks like more trips. I mean, it's not not great. Not great. So we have to figure out how we limit those things.
All right, last question. So I'm kind of curious, for self-driving or autonomous vehicles, you kind of mentioned it in the beginning that right now the ones that are on the street, they have a driver in them, but they're not driving it technically. Like they're sitting there and they're like in the vehicle. So is the idea that we're going to move away from having a person still sitting in the vehicle? Because this sounds so lonely to me. Like we're going to be, there's going to be less people on the street. There's going to be less people like downtown if we still have these urban centers.
Yeah.
Now, there's no one to talk to, and we're just driving from A to B and then ordering online, going towards all.
So, I mean, so there is another question of what the social effects are going to be. And I'm not sure. So I don't mean to say that, like, we're definitely going to go into this, like, tumbleweed, desolate, everyone, like, just stays inside their house ordering things online, right? Because, like, as I mentioned before, in theory, we're going to have more time. Because it's hard to believe, but, we're not going to, the transportation is not going to fill as much of our lives, hopefully. And that we're going to be able to, transportation time will be productive time, right? Or time that we can do things. And so there's the opportunity that maybe, that it will push us to not the loneliness kind of piece. And there's also, what are we going to do with all that time? Maybe we'll go out to the movies more. Maybe the movie's not good. We'll go out to dinner more, right? That's absolutely possible. So I think those kinds of things might happen. And there's also, if we go to like the paratransit, the small kind of trips where I've got 3 or 4 people getting, that might be a huge boon for, it's strange to walk into a bus of like, 50 people and sit down and be like, hey, how are you doing? Every time I get in a lift, I talk to my driver. Every time, right? So maybe if I'm in a lift and there's one other person there, I sit down, hey, how are you doing? And it's a great opportunity for like social, kind of building social capital. We don't know. But that is a question. Great social experiments to be done. Like maybe like if you can say 3 things about the person you're riding with, there's 50 cents off your ride or something. And we could try it out. The great thing is the technology. You can just do it, and like you'll know in a couple of weeks like what the impacts are. Anyway, thank you. Great questions.
All right, let's thank Professor Larco. So if you did ask a question, please come to me to make sure I marked it down. And if you have not, turn in your questions. And next week, we're looking forward to Christy Currents is going to present on IT trip generation data. Oh, thank you.
Look at the blog, urbanismnext.uorg.edu, and subscribe to it. Great. Thank you.